updated. You can already download the PowerPoint in PDF form from HAC's website at www.ruralhome.org/poverty-map. Now I'm going to turn it over to Moises Loza, our Executive Director. He's going to give you a brief introduction.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon and good morning. I want to thank you for joining us today in this important discussion on poverty in the United States. My name is Moises Loza. I am the Director of the Housing Assistance Council. The Housing Assistance Council is a national nonprofit organization that supports affordable housing efforts in rural areas of the United States. 40 years ago, HAC was created to address poverty and housing inadequacies in rural America. In 1984, HAC published Taking Stock, one of the first comprehensive assessments of rural poverty and housing conditions in the United States. A key component of that report was HAC's National Poverty Map, detailing poverty rates for every county in the United States. HAC has continued to present Taking Stock every 10 years following the release of it. The newest Taking Stock report will be published later this year. As the prelude to the 2012 edition of Taking Stock, HAC has developed a newly updated poverty map entitled...
people are having trouble hearing you. If you could... why don't we just move you over here?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry about that, folks.
Our microphone. Jeez.
Okay, checking.
I apologize. We're trying out a new phone system, and apparently it's still got some glitches on it. But if you don't mind rehearing what I've already said, I'll start again. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. And I wanted to thank you for joining us. My name is Moises Loza. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Assistance Council. I started to talk about our Taking Stock report, which initially was published 40 years ago. And in effect, it was a comprehensive assessment of rural poverty and housing conditions in rural America, taken from the 1980 census. HAC has continued to present Taking Stock every 10 years following the release of census data. The newest Taking Stock report will be published later this year. As a prelude to the 2012 edition of Taking Stock, HAC has developed a newly updated poverty map entitled Poverty in the United States. The map shows county-level poverty data from 2010 census counts. Can you hear all right? While some gains have been made in reducing poverty over the past several decades, poverty rates are still alarmingly high for certain populations in rural America, particularly minorities and children. HAC's research illustrates the continued persistence of high poverty within several predominantly rural regions and populations, such as Central Appalachia, the Lower Mississippi Delta, the Southern Black Belt, the Colonias region along the U.S.-Mexico border, Native American lands, and migrant and seasonal farm workers. Often forgotten or hidden from mainstream America, these areas and populations had high poverty rates of 20% or higher in 1990, 2000, and still in 2010. HAC's poverty map presents the stark reality that too many Americans have been left behind or shut out of our nation's economic promise and prosperity. We hope that you will display this poster to inform others on the issue of poverty in the United States. In the coming months, HAC will present additional research products highlighting social, economic, and housing characteristics of rural Americans. Please look to HAC's website for more information on poverty and housing conditions in rural America, www.ruralhome.org. Thank you again for joining us and for your interest in this issue. At this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Lance George, HAC's Director of Research and Information, to provide some details of HAC's poverty map and the issue of poverty in rural America. Lance?
Thank you, Moises. In releasing HAC's poverty map today, we just wanted to provide you with a brief background on some of the underlying data and some basic elements about the map. I would say that poverty, preceding our remarks, poverty is it's a relatively dynamic and complex issue. And our presentation today is no way, it's a very basic presentation. In no way are we attempting to explain or look at the root causes of poverty. However, we do want to provide a general presentation of the characteristics and incidents of poverty in the United States, which we think have been overlooked and understated. Moises was providing you with some a brief historic overview of the HAC's poverty map as it relates to the Taking Stock report. And I just wanted to provide a brief geographic illustration of that. You may be seeing on your screen now, I'm sorry, I advanced too quickly. What was HAC's first Taking Stock report in the lower left-hand corner, and this was actually the first Taking Stock poverty map released in 1980. You'll notice that it's somewhat tattered. I believe it's the only copy of the map we have available. So it's a little yellowed and a little tattered, but that was the very first poverty map that we released in 1984. As Moises noted, we have followed the report every decade after, following the release of decennial census data, and this was the follow-up to the initial report, and this is the 1990 map. And then many of you may have on your wall currently this map, which is the poverty map from 2000 and the corresponding 2000 Taking Stock report. And we hope that you will soon be replacing the map with the current edition. And you'll notice there is no Taking Stock report in the lower left-hand corner of this map. We will be releasing it later in the year. So this is the prelude to Taking Stock, but we did want to present the annual poverty map, or the decennial poverty map, that we've been releasing for the last 4 decades. You'll notice some resemblances from the current map to the past maps, and I would say we'll hopefully provide some more detail, and you'll be able to access this map electronically. I hope the resolution is not entirely clear, but this is just a scale of the map. But you'll notice some similarities with the past map, and those are that, for the most part, or in many respects, poverty is not random in the United States. There are some definite geographic patterns to poverty, and you'll notice these trends, particularly in the current map, where you see areas highlighted in darker colors, namely the red and the dark blue. Under the current the map, and the underlying data for this map are 2010 data from the Census Bureau, the small area income and poverty estimates. So it's a county level presentation. That's the primary component of the map. You'll notice the dark red areas, or the red areas, indicate counties with poverty rates of 20% or more. The darker blue areas indicate poverty rates of 30% or more in 2010. Again, those are estimates. It's not, and I don't believe that it's, another important component is the yellow counties actually have poverty rates of 17% or more, which is higher than the national rate. An additional, and just to let you know that that map might not be so clear on your screen, but once you're able to access the electronic version of the map, you'll be able to zoom in and look at actual or more closer detail of the map, or when you receive the actual full-size copy. This is just an example of North and South Dakota, the kind of a zoom in on those states. To provide a little longitudinal perspective, I'm sorry.
Well, actually,
I'm sorry. Dan's going to help with some technical issues.
Sorry about this, folks. Some people are looking for the call-in number, so I'm just going to broadcast it in a chat. Again, sorry for the delay, but we want to make sure everyone can hear this. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Dan. We apologize for the technical difficulties. And as Dan noted, the webinar and the PowerPoint presentation will be loaded on HAC's website for later access after the current webinar. But we did want to present a general view, look at longitudinal poverty over the last 50 years. And you'll notice this graphic illustrates poverty rates from 1960 to 2010. And one term that we often use is that poverty has roller coastered throughout this period, generally lower in times of greater economic prosperity and higher in times of economic decline and recession. I do believe it's important to note, though, throughout this kind of longer perspective, that poverty really hasn't dipped below the 10% level nationally in the last 50 years. But that's just a longer-term look, and also those are poverty rates for the last 50 years for the United States, not for rural areas. The next graphic we illustrate poverty by location, and as you'll notice, poverty rates are higher in urban and rural and small-town communities. According to estimates from the 2006 to 2010 American Community Survey, the national poverty rate is somewhere around 13.8%. However, you see from the illustration that it's somewhat higher in rural and urban communities. Overall, the ACS estimates about 40 million Americans have incomes below the poverty line. Over 10 million of those live in rural and small-town communities, constituting more than 1/4 of all persons living in poverty. We'd like to drill down a little farther and give you just a brief geographic illustration, and this is rural and small-town poverty by state. And you'll notice kind of a stark trend geographically where poverty is concentrated at a much higher level in the southeastern and southern United States. 9 of the 10 states with the highest rural and small-town poverty are actually located in the southern United States, or southeastern United States. And New Mexico is the only state that is actually within the top 10 that is not in the southeastern United States. But all of the lightly pink-shaded county or states have rural and small-town poverty rates above 17%, and those with dark red states have poverty rates above 20%. Another take on that is actually, in addition to the proportion, is just looking at the absolute number of people in poverty in those states. And I hope the graphic comes through, but the gold circles illustrate the absolute number of people in poverty in those states. So you'll notice the larger the circle, the more actual persons in states. The underlying graphic is the proportion. So with this analysis, more than 50% of all rural and small-town people in poverty live in the southeastern United States. Texas has the largest number of rural and small-town people in poverty, with more than 700,000, and more than 500,000 rural and small-town people in the state of North Carolina also live in poverty. Those are the states with the 2 highest whole number of persons in poverty, or absolute number of persons in poverty. Poverty rates have improved for the most part in many respects over the past 20 or 30 years, but in among certain populations, poverty remains stubbornly high. This graphic illustrates poverty by race and ethnicity in rural and small-town communities. You'll notice the poverty rates are higher among racial and ethnic minorities in rural communities. In fact, the poverty rate for rural minorities is twice the rate of white not Hispanics in rural communities. They're also higher than their minority counterparts nationwide. The yellow bars indicate the minority or the population for the nation, the poverty rate for the nation, and the red bars indicate the poverty rate for rural and ethnic minorities in small town and rural areas. I think it's also important to note that many of these poverty levels have actually not been declining. The poverty rate for Native Americans is above 30%, and the poverty rate for rural African Americans is especially high, also above 30%. And these really haven't declined even over the last decade, or we were looking back to 1980. The poverty rate for rural African Americans was consistently around 30% in 1980. The current ACS estimate is that currently it's still above 30%. While rural and small-town poverty rates are higher for minorities, it is important to note that most people in rural and small-town areas living in poverty are white, not Hispanics. Over 60% of the persons in poverty in rural areas are actually white and not Hispanic. So I think that's an important consideration to take in as well. We also wanted to briefly look at poverty among vulnerable populations. And one indicator that we can pull are children living in poverty. So the rate of children under the age of 18 living in poverty, as you'll note, is substantially higher than the national rate, than the national overall poverty rate. at 22% in rural and small town areas, and the rate, the farthest bar to the right is actually children living in poverty under the age of 5, which is even higher at over 26%. I think there's an ample amount of evidence of the incidence of poverty among children and the long-term impacts of that. So we would just basically wanted to present that issue. I think one of the more remarkable stories, or one of the successes as of recently or over recent decades, is the decline in poverty among the older population. This graph illustrates poverty rates for the nation and for persons aged 65 and older over about the last 40 years. As you'll note, in the early 1960s or the mid-1960s, the poverty rate for persons over the age of 65 was nearly 30%. However, it has declined precipitously, largely due to social safety net programs, Medicare, supplementary security income, and Social Security. And it fell below the national rate sometime in the mid-1980s and has consistently been below the national rate until this period. So this is an accomplishment in reducing poverty. However, it's important to note that, one, poverty rates for seniors are still higher in rural and small town communities. The national rate for persons age 65 and older living in poverty is about 10%. It's over 11% in rural and small town communities. And there's a definite difference by gender. Senior women or women over the age of 65 have a much higher incidence of poverty than their male counterparts. And it's even higher for women who live alone. We didn't kind of indicate that on this chart, but it's even higher among that population. And finally, we wanted to look at the issue of what we would call persistent or long-term poverty. This is an important indicator of poverty, and it simply looks at communities that have had poverty rates of 20% or more over the last 3 decades or last 3 censuses. So these counties highlighted in green on the map have had poverty rates of 20% or more in 1990, 2000, and 2010. HAC has classified 429 of these counties. They have a population of over 21 million persons. Is largely minority. Over 60% of the population in these counties are white, are not white, and are minority or Hispanic. The poverty rates, and one instance about these counties, or one statistic, is you can say almost everything is double, or many major characteristics are double. The poverty rate in these counties is twice the national rate. The poverty rate among minorities in these counties is even higher, at above 30%. The median income is much lower. The incidence of housing conditions are often most prevalent or more visible, the impact of poverty on housing conditions. The crowding rate, household crowding rate in these communities is twice the national rate. The incidence of housing cost burden among renters, more than 50% of renters in these areas are housing cost burdened and pay more than 30% of their monthly income towards their housing outlays. And maybe one of the more distressing issues about persistent poverty counties is that they're actually decreasing. If you use the same metric in the last census, the number of persistent poverty counties has increased by about 8%. There were 398 persistent poverty counties in 2000, and now we've classified over 429. The red counties indicate areas that have been added to the persistent poverty county list, and the lighter blue areas, which are a little harder to discern, are counties that actually dropped out. But in total, there was a net gain in persistent poverty counties and populations over the last decade. And in many respects, these populations in these areas are kind of hidden from mainstream and larger America. This is often what we call hidden poverty, but very distressing. These counties are almost also exclusively rural. 88% of them have exclusively rural populations, and they're just a largely rural population in the rural percentage of the poverty, or rural portion of the persons in poverty. So that ends the basic overview of kind of poverty in rural areas. We did want to let you know that you can download the poster for free from the HAC website. We have it in 3 sizes available: 8.5 by 11, 8.5 by 14, and 11 by 17. I think we have instructions on how to download and access the poster. Additionally, we have For purchase, you can purchase a print copy of the poster for $5 from the HAC website. It's 24 by 36 and it's mailed to you in a package. And then to accompany our website, accompany our presentation today, we also have additional resources on poverty in rural areas. In advance of taking stock, we've been presenting what we call rural research notes, which are brief white papers or highlight issues in social, economic, and social demographic and housing characteristics in rural areas. We've just posted the rural research note on poverty. In addition to this, we've also posted a spreadsheet that indicates, it has basically the underlying data for the map. It has the poverty rates for all 3,141 counties that are located on the map. So you can actually access the poverty rates for your county and your communities. And with that, well, I think we'll turn it over to questions. Thank you.
Well, one of the first questions is where to access the PowerPoint presentation, which is at that same website, ruralhome.org/poverty-map. That also is where you can also get that rural research note is available for download there, and there's some other resources on rural poverty on that site. Currently, we don't have any questions. If Lance was that comprehensive, that's fantastic. We have a question. Is the data available by household size?
I don't believe, to the best of my ability, that the poverty characteristics are not presented by the size of the household. We do have general household size information, but not on the occurrence of poverty within the ACS or the detailed poverty that we analyze.
We have a question from Justin Vorbeck. Has the definition of homelessness changed in the last 50 years? Oh, no, he meant to say definition of poverty. My apologies.
No. The general definition of poverty has not changed in the last 50 years. The underlying data that are presented here provide the same measure of poverty that was instituted in 1964, I believe. So it's a consistent measure of poverty over those last years. Some of the data sets where we access the poverty estimates are different, but the general metric or measure has remained constant throughout that time period.
Okay. We have a question. It appears that the poverty counties are in Native American reservations in South Dakota, North Dakota, Arizona, and New Mexico. Is that correct?
There is a high incidence of poverty among those populations and areas. Some of the counties with the most extreme poverty rates are those that you just mentioned that are largely associated with Native American reservations or high Native American populations. Poverty is concentrated typically. Many of the persistent poverty communities are in what we classify as high need communities, and those are often Native Americans, the border colonists along the U.S.-Mexico border, the southern Black Belt in the lower Mississippi Delta, and Central Appalachia. But a large portion of those areas that you mentioned do have relatively high poverty rates and persistent poverty. At this point, we are posting the data on. I'm sorry.
And we have a question. How is the data communicated with congressional staffs and elected officials?
I might let Joe or Moises kind of address that question, but you know.
Come around. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you can hear me. We have distributed the map to some congressional offices. We'd be glad to do more of that, and we're interested in possibly doing a briefing on Capitol Hill on the map with some of the same information.
You're also welcome to share the map with your congressional delegation. I think that we will try to distribute it and get as much distribution of the map as possible with policymakers, including members of Congress. But if you yourselves also have access to people on Capitol Hill, I think it would be helpful if you also inform them and educate them some on the poverty situation in this country.
We have a question. What are reasons that keep counties persistently in poverty? Are you seeing any changes in trends to those reasons?
Thank you. I believe that we reviewed that actually in persistent poverty counties, there's been an increase in those counties. These areas have often suffered from, I would say, decades, if not centuries, of neglect and disinvestment socially and economically. We do have a more detailed analysis of persistent poverty counties, but I do think there are kind of deep-seated economic disinvestment in many of these areas that results in low incomes and high poverty rates.
Okay, another question. When do we expect to publish the full Taking Stock report?
We will be releasing the full report on Taking Stock at our national conference in the first week of December.
December 6th and 7th.
December 6th and 7th specifically.
Where can we access the report that was just alluded to for the persistent poverty areas?
Yes, thanks, Dan. We actually have a section on persistent poverty communities in the rural research note that was posted on the HAC website, and there will be a more detailed analysis in the Taking Stock report that Moises just mentioned that will be released later this year.
It's the same website as the map and everything else. It's all there.
Good question.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Lance, how would you say these very high poverty rural areas compare with urban and suburban, central city and suburban areas in poverty?
We haven't done a direct geographic analysis. Nationally, urban, what we classify as urban poverty, is a percentage or a few percentage points higher than rural poverty. And there are some deep concentrated areas of poverty in cities. We use the county as the primary metric, and in some more concentrated cities, the poverty rate would be much higher. So it's not a direct comparison, but overall, I think they're consistent among many. They suffer from some of the many or similar conditions, but overall, probably urban poverty is slightly higher than rural poverty, just on the larger metric.
Okay. Yeah, Brent Cooper. Are you able to quantify any impact USDA single-family housing eligible area remapping may have on rural poverty rates?
No, I don't believe we've done that level yet. We basically, it's difficult to assess the market of USDA eligible areas because they don't align very closely to census geography. We have conducted an analysis of the eligibility, the potential change in eligibility for USDA eligible areas. However, we didn't directly kind of tie social and economic characteristics to that other than population change. But that's an excellent suggestion for us to review.
And can you talk more about the connection between high poverty areas and housing conditions? How do we know about these correlations?
I would also stress, to go back to my initial comments, that we haven't done a deep statistical analysis here. This is a presentation of what we would call descriptive statistics. So I can't say for certain that we've made those kind of analyses or make claims to that level. I think we've seen some basic characteristics within these high poverty counties of extremely poor housing conditions on the most basic levels. Again, the number of units lacking adequate plumbing facilities is twice the national rate. The crowding rate is the household crowding rate is twice the national rate, and there are severe affordability problems in these areas. And it's important to note that housing costs in these areas are actually relatively low. It's just that incomes are so low that many households have a difficulty or inability to meet their housing costs. So I have to say I can't really answer that question definitively because we haven't done a detailed analysis or any type of correlation. We're just presenting descriptive statistics. But on the surface, there do appear to be much higher housing problems or much greater housing problems in these areas than the nation as a whole.
Okay, we got a HAC board member here. Sunise Hawkins asks, how did you determine poverty in rural America using the census data?
It's a basic characteristic where there's a poverty threshold in the U.S. every year. However, the information are just presented at persons below poverty. And not all persons, it's important to note that not all persons in the population or in an area are counted in poverty calculations. Certain persons who are institutionalized in nursing homes, in prisons, in military barracks are not counted in the poverty count. But it's basically the number is a very specific number for all geographies that's actually presented within the census data. So it's presented as the number of persons with incomes below poverty. And it's, in a few instances is broken out by various social and demographic characteristics. That's why we can present poverty estimates for persons over age 65 and persons under age 18. But for the most part, I will have to say that general poverty information in the census is quite limited. We wish we could do more, but it is somewhat limited. Thank you.
Joe, another question.
Yeah, Lance, could you say something about the case studies that are going to be in the main Taking Stock report? I think you've been sort of tracking certain counties for the last 30 or 40 years and seeing what's happened there.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, in addition to, this is more the statistical analysis or a component of the statistical analysis that goes in Taking Stock, but it's important to note the report going back to 1980 also paid particular attention to, again, what we classified as high poverty or persistent poverty areas. And we have studied these regions statistically and also gone to 5 select communities. And we've returned to those communities every decade to see what has changed. And they are often kind of seated in the middle of these persistent poverty areas. And these communities that we've been going to have particularly high poverty rates and levels of economic distress. So it's been interesting to kind of assess them from a longitudinal perspective and look and see how things have changed and how they haven't. And in many respects, I think they're emblematic of some of the comments that we made that these communities are often hidden from mainstream America, and I think that's illustrated in the report. This, again, is another component of Taking Stock that's unique to the report.
It seems like the questions have run their course and petered out. Anyone want to say anything in closing?
Well, one of the things we hope that these studies and these maps help us do is educate and inform the public about the problems of poverty. We're not the only ones trying to do that, but we're trying to make our contribution. Specifically for rural America, I think that in the past it has helped us. For example, the Cranston-Gonzalez Act had an allocation of funds, CDBG and other funds, going to non-metro areas, and that was influenced by the reports in Taking Stock. The information was helpful in getting those allocations possible in Cranston-Gonzalez. The Department of Agriculture allocates funds, 502 and 515 funds, to the field based on poverty rates and things of that sort, and that also has been influenced by our poverty maps and our studies. So it does have an effect. I think the most important effect it has is if all of us use it to go to our policymakers and continue to press on the case that something needs to be done about poverty, in this case particularly rural poverty. And I think over the long term we hope that it begins to make a difference overall in the condition of our country.
Thank you, Moises. We appreciate it. I don't really want to follow Moises, but other than to say we appreciate you joining us today. We've thrown a lot of statistics and figures at you, but I think it's important to note that poverty is not an abstract condition for over 40 million Americans and 10 million Americans in rural areas. It's a daily struggle with accessing, security, health care, and good, decent quality housing. So I think that's the most important point that we want to take from this, and that we ask that you kind of display the poster and let other people know that. Thank you. Again, and also to reiterate that many of these resources and the map itself will be posted on the HAC website. And if you have additional questions, don't hesitate to contact us. That's what we're here for, is to hopefully provide more information and help people understand this better.
That it?
All right.
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Please stand by.